The storm came without warning that night, rolling across the purple mountains of Earth 7 like an angry god waking from sleep. And Elias Vance stood at his kitchen window, watching the lightning tear the sky apart while he held a cup of cold coffee in his weathered hands. He was 62 years old now, his hair more gray than brown, his face lined with the stories of 100 battlefields and 1,000 surgeries, performed in places no doctor should ever have to work. And he had come to this frontier world to find peace after decades of war. The colonial medical corps had taken everything from him: his youth, his marriage, his faith in the goodness of the universe, but it had also given him skills that no other human possessed. Skills that let him heal wounds that should have been fatal and save lives that everyone else had given up. On outside his small farmhouse, the wind screamed through the alien trees with their silver leaves and blue bark, and the 2 moons of Earth 7 disappeared behind clouds so thick they seemed solid enough to walk upon. Elias turned away from the window and moved toward his bedroom, thinking only of sleep and the quiet dreams that sometimes came to old soldiers when they finally stopped running from their memories. But then the ground shook beneath his feet, and a sound like thunder mixed with breaking stone filled the air. And he grabbed the doorframe to keep from falling as his entire house trembled and groaned. He ran outside without thinking, his medical instincts taking over before his rational mind could stop them. And what he saw in his northern field made him freeze in place with his mouth hanging open like a child seeing snow for the first time. A dragon had fallen from the sky. She was enormous, at least 40 meters from snout to tail, her scales the color of deep ocean water mixed with streaks of burning copper, and her wings lay spread across his crops like broken sails from some impossible ship. The Draconi were legends on Earth 7. Ancient beings who had traveled between stars when humanity was still learning to make fire. And they rarely spoke to humans or acknowledged their existence at all. But this one was looking directly at Elias with eyes like molten gold. And in those eyes he saw something that made his heart clench tight inside his chest. He saw despair. She was crying. This massive creature who could burn cities to ash with a single breath. And her tears fell like rain and turned to steam when they touched her superheated scales. Elias walked toward her slowly, his hands raised to show he meant no harm, his voice soft as he called out words of comfort, even though he did not know if she could understand them. "Easy now. Easy," he said. "I am not here to hurt you. I just want to help if I can." The dragon lifted her head, and that was when Elias saw what she held clutched against her chest. Protected by claws as long as his entire body, it was a baby dragon, a hatchling no bigger than a large dog. And its scales were pale and dull instead of bright and shimmering like its mother's. Little one was breathing, but barely, its small chest rising and falling in a rhythm that Elias recognized all too well from his years of medical training. The rhythm of something dying. "Please," the mother dragon spoke, and her voice was like music played on instruments made of fire and stone, beautiful and terrible at the same time. "Please help my son." Elias stared at her, unable to believe what he was hearing, because no Draconi had ever asked a human for help in the entire history of both their species. "What happened to him?" he asked, moving closer despite every survival instinct telling him to run from this creature who could kill him with a single careless movement. "He was born wrong," the mother said, and fresh tears spilled from her golden eyes. "His heart furnace never formed correctly, and our healers say there is nothing to be done. They say I should let him go and try again with another clutch." She lowered her head until her snout nearly touched the ground, and her voice became a whisper that Elias felt more than heard. "But he is my only child, the last of my eggs to survive, and I cannot let him die without trying everything, without begging every power in this universe for mercy." Elias looked at the hatchling, at its shallow breathing and its dim scales, and its small face twisted with pain. It was too young to understand. And something inside him that he thought had died long ago suddenly woke up and stretched and filled his chest with fire of its own. "Bring him inside," he said. And his voice carried the authority of a man who had spent 30 years fighting death and refusing to lose. "Bring him into my barn where I can examine him properly." The mother dragon stared at him with an expression he could not read. And then she spoke again in that voice of fire and wonder. "You would help us?" she asked. "Even though we are not your kind, even though my people have ignored yours for centuries, even though every other being we asked turned us away," Elias smiled. And it was not a kind smile or a gentle smile, but the fierce and determined smile of a man who had found his purpose again after years of wandering lost. "Lady," he said, "I have pulled soldiers from burning wreckage and stitched their guts back together with nothing but fishing line and hope. I have brought children back from the edge of death when their own parents had already started grieving. I have fought the Reaper so many times he probably knows my face." He reached out and placed his hand on the hatchling's snout, feeling the heat that radiated from even this small and sickly dragon. And he made a promise that he knew might cost him everything. "Your son is not going to die tonight. Not if I have anything to say about it." The mother dragon rose to her feet, her massive body blocking out the storm clouds. And she cradled her dying child with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a creature of her size and power. "I am called Cirith," she said, "and this is my son Kale. And if you save him, I will owe you a debt that my people have never owed to any other species in all our long history." Elias turned and walked toward his barn, and behind him came the mother dragon carrying the hope of her bloodline in her claws. And above them the storm continued to rage, but neither of them noticed anymore. They had work to do, and death was not going to wait politely while they got ready to fight him. The barn was not designed to hold a dragon, but Cirith made herself as small as she could, curling her massive body into corners and folding her wings tight against her sides while Elias worked on her son under the harsh white light of his medical lamp scale lay on a table that Elias had reinforced with metal beams from his storage shed. And even unconscious, the hatchling radiated enough heat to make the air shimmer and dance like summer. Mirages on desert roads. Elias had stripped down to just his undershirt, sweat pouring down his face as he ran his scanning equipment over the little dragon's body and studied the results on screens that flickered from the electromagnetic interference caused by being so close to draconic biology. What he found made him sit down heavily on a nearby crate and run his fingers through his wet hair while he tried to make sense of the impossible. The hatchling's heart furnace, the organ that gave dragons their fire and their life force and their connection to whatever strange energy powered their species, had only partially developed during his time inside the egg. One of the two chambers that should have existed simply was not there, and the remaining chamber was working twice as hard to compensate, burning itself out in a desperate attempt to keep the young dragon alive. "How long does he have?" Cirith asked, and her voice trembled with the fear of a mother who already knew the answer would be bad. "Days," Elias said. "Maybe a week if he is lucky, but probably less than that." The mother dragon made a sound that was somewhere between a growl and a sob, and the temperature in the barn rose by several degrees as her emotional state affected her. "Internal fires. Our healers said the same thing," she whispered. "They said his furnace would burn out and his flame would die, and there was nothing anyone could do because this is simply how nature works." Elias stood up and began pacing back and forth, his mind racing through every surgery he had ever performed and every medical miracle he had ever witnessed and every crazy idea that had ever saved a life when nothing else would work. "Tell me about these healers of yours," he said. "Tell me exactly what they tried." Cirith tilted her great head in confusion. because no one had ever asked her this question before. They examined him and consulted the ancient texts and performed the traditional rituals, she said. And when none of that worked, they declared him beyond saving and told me to prepare for his journey to the stars. But did they try to fix him? Elias pressed. Did they attempt surgery or medication or any kind of direct intervention? Surgery. Sireth repeated the word as if she had never heard it before. You mean cutting him open and reaching inside his body to repair what is broken? Yes, exactly that. The mother dragon shook her head slowly, and Elias could see genuine surprise in her golden eyes. We do not do such things, she said. The Draconi believe that what nature creates, only nature should change. And to cut open a body is to violate the sacred design of the universe. Elias stopped pacing and stared at her with an expression that mixed disbelief with something that might have been pity. So you are telling me, he said carefully, that your species has traveled between stars for 100,000 years, has built empires that span galaxies, has technology that makes human science look like children playing with toys. But you never developed surgery. It is forbidden, Sireth said simply. The weak are mourned and released, and the strong continue forward. This is the way it has always been. I laughed. And it was not a pleasant laugh, but the bitter sound of a man who had seen too much death caused by stupidity and tradition and the unwillingness to try something new. Well, that is about to change, he said. Because I am going to operate on your son and build him a new heart chamber and save his life whether you're ancient, traditions like it or not. Sireth rose up, her head nearly touching the ceiling of the barn. And for a moment Elias thought she might kill him for his disrespect. But instead she lowered herself again and spoke in a voice heavy with exhaustion and desperate hope. Can you really do this? She asked. Can a human truly succeed where Draconi wisdom has failed? I do not know, Elias admitted. Your son runs hotter than any patient I have ever worked on. And I would need to design equipment that can withstand temperatures that would melt normal surgical tools. And I would have to figure out how. Draconi biology works well enough to build him an artificial heart chamber. He paused and looked at the sleeping hatchling, at his pale scales and his labored breathing and his tiny claws that twitched as he dreamed whatever dreams dying dragons dream. But I'm going to try anyway. Elias continued. Because that is what humans do when someone needs help. We try even when trying seems pointless. We fight even when fighting seems hopeless. He walked to his communication console and began sending messages to everyone he had ever known in the medical field, explaining the situation and asking for advice and requesting supplies that probably did not exist. Yet the responses came back within hours. And almost all of them said the same thing. You are insane. This is impossible. Do not waste your life on a dragon that nature has already condemned, Elias. Deleted every single message without replying and got to work. He spent 3 days without sleep, designing a cooling suit from parts he salvaged from old spaceships in the planetary junkyard, engineering surgical tools from ceramic and polymer compounds that could withstand extreme heat, synthesizing anesthetics that might work on Draconi. Physiology based on nothing but theory and guesswork. Sireth watched him work with growing amazement. This small human who refused to accept the judgment of the universe and instead built machines to challenge it. Why are you doing this? She finally asked on the third night, when Elias was so tired he could barely stand but still refused to stop working. He looked up from his workbench, his eyes red and his hands shaking from exhaustion, and gave her an answer that would echo through Draconi history for generations to come. Because where I come from, he said, we do not let children die if there is even a 1% chance of saving them. We do not surrender to fate or accept the natural order. We fight and we struggle and we rage against the dying of the light. He turned back to his work, attaching the final components to his impossible cooling suit. "Your son deserves a chance to live," Elias said, "and I'm going to give him one, even if it kills me in the process." Sirith lowered her great head and watched this strange little creature continue his mad preparations. And for the first time since her son had been born, she felt something she had almost forgotten how to feel. She felt hope. On the fourth day, Elias stood before Sirith wearing the strangest suit of armor anyone had ever seen. A patchwork creation of cooling tubes and heat shields and reflective panels that made him look like a robot designed by a madman. "Are you ready?" the mother dragon asked, her voice tight with fear and anticipation. "No," Elias admitted with a tired smile. "But your son cannot wait for me to feel ready. So we do this now." He had transformed part of his barn into an operating room, with cooling fans pointed at the surgical table from every angle and emergency equipment standing by and a complicated system of tubes that would pump ice-cold fluid through his suit to keep him from cooking alive. Kale lay on the reinforced table, sedated with the experimental drugs Elias had created, his small body rising and falling with shallow breaths as his failing heart furnace struggled to keep him alive. "I need you to do something for me during the surgery," Elias said to Sirith. "Your son's body temperature needs to stay within a certain range, or the anesthesia will not work properly. So when I give you a signal, I need you to breathe fire on him in small controlled bursts." Sirith nodded, understanding that she would be part of the team trying to save her child, rather than just a helpless observer. "I will do whatever you need," she said. "Just tell me, and I will do it." Elias took a deep breath and activated his cooling suit, feeling the blessed chill of the circulating fluid wash over his body as the temperature displays on his helmet showed the barn was already above 100 degrees Celsius. He picked up his ceramic scalpel and began. The moment he made the first incision, Kale's body reacted with a surge of heat that nearly overwhelmed the cooling systems. And Elias had to pause while his suit compensated and the fans worked overtime to keep the air from becoming completely unbearable inside the hatchling's chest cavity. Everything glowed orange and red like the inside of a volcano. And Elias found himself operating in conditions that no human doctor had ever experienced. The heart furnace was exactly where his scans had shown it would be. A pulsing organ that looked like a combination of a heart and a star. And he could see immediately what was wrong. The missing chamber was supposed to be on the left side, and instead there was just scar tissue and malformed connections that had never properly developed. "Temperature dropping," Sirith called out, reading the monitors that Elias had taught her to understand. "He is getting too cold." "Give me a burst," Elias said without looking up. Short and controlled, the mother dragon leaned forward and exhaled a precise stream of fire that washed over her son's body. And immediately, the temperature reading stabilized. Elias continued working, his hands steady despite the impossible conditions, using tools he had invented just days ago to perform a surgery that had never been attempted in the history of the universe. Had created an artificial heart chamber from biosynthetic materials, a device roughly the size of his fist that was designed to integrate with draconic tissue and function like the organ Kale had been born. Without attaching it was the hardest thing Elias had ever done. He had to connect blood vessels that ran hotter than molten metal, had to fuse the artificial chamber to living tissue that wanted to reject it, had to work with hands that were beginning to shake from exhaustion and heat exposure. 3 hours into the surgery, Kale's single heart chamber began to fail. The monitors screamed warnings, and Sirith cried out in terror as her son's vital signs plummeted toward death. "No," Elias growled, refusing to accept what the machines were telling him. "Not today. Not on my table." He grabbed a device he had built for exactly this moment, a modified defibrillator designed to work on draconic physiology, and pressed it against the hatchling's failing heart furnace. The shock made Kale's whole body convulse. And for one terrible second, nothing happened. Then the heart chamber began beating again, stronger than before. And Elias let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. "Keep going," he told himself. "You are not done yet." 7 hours into the surgery, word had spread across the planet that a human was attempting to save a draconi hatchling, and other dragons began arriving to witness what they assumed would be a spectacular failure. They landed in the fields around the barn. Great creatures of every color and size, their ancient eyes watching through windows and doorways as this small human fought against death itself. 8 hours in, and Kale flatlined again. This time, Elias had to shock him 3 times before his heart started beating. And each time felt like an eternity, where the whole universe held its breath. 9 hours, 10 hours. 11 hours Elias was running on nothing but willpower, and the stubborn refusal to quit that had carried him through every impossible situation he had ever faced. Finally, just before midnight on the 4th day, he connected the last blood vessel to the artificial chamber and stepped back from the table. "Come on," he whispered, watching the monitors with eyes that burned from sweat and exhaustion. "Come on, little one. Show me you want to live." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the artificial chamber began the pulse, slowly at first and then faster, matching the rhythm of the original heart furnace in a synchronization that seemed almost miraculous. Kale's vital signs stabilized, his breathing deepened, and then, for the first time since he had been born, a soft amber glow began to emanate from his chest as his new heart chamber produced the fire that all dragons carried inside them. The hatchling opened his eyes, looked up at the strange creature in the cooling suit standing over him, and made a small sound that might have been confusion or might have been gratitude. Elias pulled off his helmet, his face red and burned in several places where the cooling had not been enough, and smiled down at his patient. "Welcome back to the world of the living," he said. "Your mother has been waiting for you." Sirith pushed forward, her massive head filling the space above the surgical table. And when she saw her son's eyes open and his chest glowing with true dragon fire, she let out a sound that was half roar and half sob. Dragons gathered outside began to murmur among themselves, because they had just witnessed something that their entire species had believed was impossible. A human had saved a dragon. A human had looked at a condemned child and refused to accept the condemnation. A human had done what 100,000 years of draconic wisdom had declared could not be. Elias collapsed into a chair, his body finally giving out now that the crisis was over, and watched his mother and son reunited in his barn. He was burned and exhausted, and probably in need of serious medical attention himself, but he was smiling because death had come for Kale tonight, and Elias had looked death in the eye and told him no. The days following the surgery were filled with wonder and tension in equal measure, as Kale grew stronger with each passing hour, and the dragons of Vera 7 debated what this human miracle meant for their ancient ways. Elias spent most of his time resting and recovering from the burns and exhaustion that the surgery had cost him, sleeping in his farmhouse, while Sirith and her son remained in the barn that had become their temporary home. The little hatchling was a curious creature, and once he was strong enough to move around, he began exploring everything with the fearless enthusiasm of the young. He followed Elias like a puppy, fascinated by this strange two-legged being who smelled like medicine and moved so slowly compared to dragons. "He has bonded with you," Sirith explained one morning as Kale curled up at Elias's feet while the human drank his coffee. "In our culture, this is a sacred thing, when a dragon chooses a companion." Elias looked down at the hatchling, whose scales had begun to brighten into beautiful shades of silver and blue, now that his heart was working properly, and felt something warm in his chest that had nothing to do with the heat radiating from the small dragon. "I have never had a pet before," he said with a small laugh. "He is not your pet," Sirith corrected gently. He is your charge, your responsibility, your family in the eyes of dragonkind. Before Elias could respond to this unexpected declaration, a shadow passed over the farmhouse, and the ground began to tremble. With the force of something massive approaching, he ran outside and stopped dead in his tracks when he saw what was descending from the sky. She was the largest dragon he had ever seen, easily 3 times the size of Cirith, with scales so dark they seemed to absorb light itself, and eyes that burned with the cold fire of distant stars. Other dragons followed in her wake, forming a circle around the farmhouse as if preparing for some kind of ceremony or trial. The High Matriarch, Cirith whispered, her voice filled with awe and fear. She has come herself. The enormous dragon landed with a grace that seemed impossible for something so vast. And when she spoke, her voice made the very air vibrate with power and authority. I am Vexoria, she announced. Keeper of the ancient laws, speaker for the eternal flame. Ruler of the Draconi for longer than your species has existed human. Elias stood his ground, though every instinct in his body was screaming at him to run and hide from this creature who could destroy him with a thought. My name is Elias Vance, he replied, keeping his voice steady through sheer force of will. And I am the one who saved the hatchling. Yes, Vexoria said, and there was no warmth in her voice. You are the one who violated our most sacred laws, who cut open a dragon's body in defiance of everything we believe, who decided that human arrogance was more important than Draconi tradition. The other dragons murmured in agreement, and Elias could feel their anger like heat against his skin. I saved a child's life, he said simply. I do not see how that violates anything worth believing in. Vexoria lowered her massive head until her eye was level with Elias's entire body, and he could see ancient intelligence and terrible power swirling in those star-bright depths. The weak are meant to die, she said. This is the way of nature. This is how species become strong. This is the law that has guided us since the first dragons flew between the stars. Then your law is wrong, Elias said. And the words came out before he could stop them. Silence fell over the gathering. A silence so complete that Elias could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. No one had ever spoken to the High Matriarch this way. No one had ever dared. Explain yourself, human, Vexoria commanded, and her voice carried the promise of destruction if his explanation was not satisfactory. Elias took a deep breath and spoke the words that would change history. Your people have ruled the stars for 100,000 years, he began. You have built empires and survived catastrophes and achieved things that my species can barely imagine. But somewhere along the way you forgot something that we humans never forgot. Something that makes us who we are, even though we are young and weak and small compared to you. He looked at Kale, who had emerged from the barn and was watching the confrontation with wide, frightened eyes. And then he looked back at the ancient dragon, who held his fate in her claws. The measure of a civilization is not how it treats the strong, Elias said. Any fool can honor the powerful and celebrate the healthy, and make room for those who need no help. The true measure of greatness is how a people treats the ones who cannot fight for themselves, how they care for the sick and the weak and the broken, how hard they are willing to work to save a single life that others have given up on. He pointed at Kale, at this small dragon who should have died, but instead stood alive and burning with the fire that was his birthright. That child was not a defect to be discarded, Elias continued. He was a person who needed help, who deserved a chance to live and grow and discover what he might become. And where I come from, we do not let children die just because saving them is difficult. Vexoria stared at him for a long moment, and Elias could not tell if she was considering his words or preparing to incinerate him for his insolence. Then Cirith stepped forward, placing herself between the human and the High Matriarch, her head held high with a courage that surprised even herself. By the old laws, Sirith declared. A life saved becomes bound to the Savior, and the Savior becomes bound to the saved. This is written in the first texts and has never been questioned. She turned to face Elias, and her golden eyes were filled with something that looked like love. My son lives because of this human, she said. Therefore I claim the right of naming, the right that has not been invoked in 10,000 years. The other dragons gasped, and even Vexorius seemed taken aback by this declaration. I name Elias Vance as Ashbourne, Sirith continued, her voice ringing with formal ceremony. I name him kin to Dragonfire and brother to the Draconi. I name him family by choice, if not by blood. She spread her wings and bowed her head to the human who had saved her son, and I asked the High Matriarch to recognize this naming. As the ancient laws require, Vexoria was silent for a long time, her ancient mind processing what had just happened and what it meant for her people and their traditions. Finally, she spoke, and her voice was different now, thoughtful rather than threatening. The laws are clear, she admitted. A naming cannot be refused when a life has been saved. She turned her star-bright eyes to Elias, and for the first time, he saw something other than cold authority in her gaze. You are Ashbourne now, human, she said. The first of your kind to be welcomed into the Draconi, the first to be named as family by our people. She spread her own wings, and the gesture seemed almost like acceptance. I do not know if you are right about the measure of civilizations, Vexoria continued, but I know that Kale lives when he should have died, and I know that you made this happen through courage and skill and the stubborn refusal to accept defeat. She looked at the hatchling, who had crept forward to press against Elias's legs, and something in her ancient face softened. Perhaps, she said slowly, there are things that even old dragons can learn from young humans. And with that she launched herself into the sky, followed by the other dragons, leaving Elias and Sirith and Kale alone in the sudden quiet of the morning. Elias looked down at the small dragon leaning against him, then up at the mother who had given him a gift he never expected. Family, he said softly, tasting the word like something precious and strange. Family, Sirith agreed, and for the first time since they had met, she smiled. 20 years had passed since that stormy night when a desperate mother dragon had carried her dying child to a human farmhouse, and the galaxy had changed in ways that no one could have predicted. Elias Vance was 82 years old now, his hair completely white and his body slower than it used to be, but his mind remained sharp, and his heart remained full of the same stubborn determination that had defined his entire life. He lived in a beautiful house on Verith 7, surrounded by gardens filled with flowers from a dozen different worlds. And every morning he woke up to the sound of dragons flying overhead, because this planet had become something special, a bridge between species that had once ignored each other, a symbol of what was possible when beings from different worlds chose cooperation over isolation. The Ashbourne Institute stood at the center of the main city, a massive complex where human doctors and Draconi healers worked side by side to save lives that both species had once believed were beyond saving. Ilias had founded it 15 years ago, using the fame and influence that came from being the first human ever accepted into dragon society, and it had grown into something far beyond what he had originally imagined. Thousands of patients came through its doors every year, humans and dragons and other species as well, all seeking the kind of medicine that refused to give up on anyone. The artificial heart chambers that Ilias had invented were now common throughout the Draconi worlds, and an entire generation of dragons live today because of technology that their ancestors had considered impossible, but none of that mattered as much to Elias as the dragon who was landing in his garden. Right now Kale was fully grown, a magnificent creature with scales that shone like silver moonlight on a frozen lake. and wings that could carry him between star systems faster than any human ship. He was the ambassador now, the official representative of the Draconian Imperium to the human coalition, the first dragon to ever hold such a position, and the living proof that the old ways were not always the best ways. "Old man," Kale called out as he transformed his landing into a graceful walk. "I brought you something from my travels." He held out a small package wrapped in silk from a world that humans had never visited. And when Elias opened it, he found a bottle of wine made from fruits that grew on planets he could not even name. "You spoil me," Elias said with a smile. "Every time you visit, you bring gifts I cannot possibly deserve." "You gave me my life," Kale replied simply. "Nothing I bring you can ever repay that debt." They sat together in the garden, the old human and the young dragon, sharing stories about their adventures and their challenges and the strange path that had brought them from that desperate night to this peaceful morning. Kale spoke about the negotiations he had been conducting with species that had never before spoken to either humans or dragons, about the alliances being formed and the possibilities being explored. The galaxy was changing because of what had happened in that barn 20 years ago. Because one human had refused to let one dragon die. Other species had heard the story, had learned about the human who saved the dragon child, and it had made them curious about both races in ways they had never been before. "They call us the stubborn ones now," Kale said with amusement. "Humans and dragons together, the species who refuse to accept limits, who fight against fate itself." Elias laughed at this, because it seemed so strange that saving one small life could lead to such enormous consequences. But then again, that was how change always happened, not through grand gestures and massive movements, but through small acts of courage and compassion that rippled outward until they touched everything. A shadow passed over the garden, and Elias looked up to see Cirith descending from the sky, her scales now silver with age, but her eyes still burning with that same golden fire he remembered from their first meeting. She landed beside her son and lowered her great head to look at the human who had become her family. "I have been thinking," she said, "about that night when I came to you, about how frightened I was and how impossible everything seemed." "I remember," Elias said softly. "I remember how you wept, and how your son barely breathed, and how everyone told me I could not save him. Everyone except yourself," Cirith added. "You never doubted, not for a single moment." Elias shook his head. "Because this was not entirely true. I doubted many times," he admitted. "During the surgery, there were moments when I was certain we would fail, when the numbers on the monitors told me that death was winning, and I was just a foolish old man who had bitten off more than he could chew." He looked at Kale, at this magnificent dragon who had grown from that pale, sickly hatchling into one of the most respected beings in the known galaxy. "But I kept going anyway," Elias continued, "because that is what you do when someone needs you. You keep going even when you are afraid. You keep fighting even when you want to give up." Cirith settled down beside him, her massive body radiating warmth that felt like comfort rather than danger. And her voice was gentle when she spoke again. "I have lived for 3,000 years, she said. "And in all that time, I never understood why the weak should be saved, why resources should be spent on those who might never contribute anything in return." She turned her golden eyes to her son, watching him with the fierce pride that only a mother can feel. "But then you saved Kale, and I watched him grow, and I saw what he became. And I finally understood." "Understood what?" Elias asked. "That you were right," Cirith said, "about everything. About the measure of civilizations and the value of every life, and the importance of fighting for those who cannot fight for themselves." She lowered her head until her snout nearly touched Elias. The same gesture she had made on that first night when she had begged him to save her son. "My people were ancient when yours were young," she continued. We had power and knowledge and wisdom that your species was only beginning to dream about. But we had forgotten something important. Something that you humans have never forgotten. And it took a broken hatchling and a stubborn doctor to remind us. Elias reached out and placed his hand on her snout, feeling the warmth of dragon fire beneath her scales, and remembered all the years that had passed since they had first become family. "What did you learn?" he asked. Though he already knew the answer. "That family is not about blood," Sirith said. "It is about who you choose to love. It is about who you fight for and who you refuse to abandon. It is about the connections we make through courage and compassion rather than the connections we are born with." She pulled back and looked at him with eyes that held 3,000 years of wisdom and 20 years of gratitude. "You chose to love my son when you had no reason to," she said. "You chose to fight for him when everyone said it was impossible. You chose to make us your family when we were nothing but strangers. And in doing so, you taught an ancient species that the youngest race in the galaxy might be the wisest of us all." Elias felt tears forming in his eyes, because he was old now and had earned the right to cry when moments became too beautiful to contain. "Thank you," he said, "for trusting me with your son, for giving me a family when I thought I would die alone, for showing me that even at the end of a long life, there can be new beginnings." Kale moved closer and wrapped one wing around the old man who had saved his life. And Sirith did the same from the other side. And for a moment they stayed like that in the garden, while the suns of Vera 7 set in the stars. Came out three beings from two different worlds, bound together not by blood but by choice, by love, by the simple truth that family is whoever you refuse to let go of and somewhere out in the galaxy. Other species were learning the same lesson. We're choosing compassion over tradition and love over isolation. We're becoming something better because one human had once looked at a dying dragon and decided to fight the Ashburn legacy. It was not a building or an institution or even a medical technique, it was an idea. A simple and powerful idea that had changed everything, that every life matters, that the weak deserve protection, that the measure of who we are is not what we take from the universe but what we give back to it, and that sometimes the smallest act of kindness can echo through the stars forever. Elias closed his eyes and leaned into the warmth of his dragon family and smiled, because this was everything he had ever wanted and more than he had ever dared to hope for. A life well lived, a family well loved, a legacy that would outlast the stars themselves.